Good afternoon, everybody. I did that right on cue. Isn't that good? See how that works? A little TV. But it's great to have everybody here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thank you very much. I'm Michael Steele, board member here at the BPC, former lieutenant governor of the great state of Maryland. So it's really nice to be with everyone this afternoon and to welcome you. Our focus today is on how the programs and dollars provided by the bipartisan infrastructure bill will supercharge the transition toward a modern electric grid and clean transportation. All those things that we've long talked about, now there are resources in place to begin to do a lot about it. And we're also going to dig into some of the questions around how such massive investments in our nation's infrastructure will affect the quality of life, as well as the economic opportunities in our communities across the country, particularly those communities that are still in desperate need of cleaner air and better job opportunities. So getting it right will require, I think we all believe, unprecedented coordination across all levels of government, and certainly a strong partnership with the private sector, which is why we're here today. So I am very honored to begin today's conversation with Maryland's amazing governor. Thank you. Just as I'm rehearsing in the back there, Governor Larry Hogan, who has been at the vanguard of the infrastructure debate and played a very important and leading role in pressing the Congress to finally get the legislation across the line. And we are also very happy to welcome and be joined by one of our region's most dynamic leaders, Calvin Butler Jr. Go way back with Calvin. It's good to see you, brother, who is the Senior Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of Exelon, which serves over 10 million customers across the Mid-Atlantic and Illinois. So we are very, very pleased to have this esteemed panel with us, and I'm going to turn it over to our president, Jason Grimay, to get things started. Jason, it's all yours.
Thank you, Michael. It's the shortest introduction you've ever made. So look, it is really great to see everybody here. I will just say, as a matter of personal privilege, we spent a lot of time on this stage talking about our ambitions and our hopes. It's nice to be here to talk about an accomplishment. You know, we have not had a lot of opportunities to talk about something that is as significant as the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And it is particularly gratifying, Governor, to be here with you. You have been at this from the beginning. Since it was Infrastructure Wednesday, you've been giving these kind of talks. And so I really do want to just thank you for everything you've done. And we'll talk a little bit about that in detail. And then also, Calvin, with someone who's going to make it work, right? Like, we really have, if you could take two people to describe both the accomplishment and the promise of this legislation, I'm sitting next to him. So with that, Governor, you've been at this for a while. You've talked about how infrastructure provides this incredible force multiplier for jobs and economic growth and transformational projects, but just like exhale. So this is a big deal, and you deserve a lot of credit for it. How do you feel about this law? What do you think it's going to do for Maryland?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, Michael, thank you. Great Marylanders up here, by the way, on the stage. A couple of them, but thank you.
Bethesda.
Y'all, everybody here. It's an all Maryland team. That's a good shout out.
Really get to brag about Bethesda.
Yeah. But I want to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for all of your work on bipartisanship and on trying to help get this bill across the finish line. It's something I've been really passionate about, both bipartisan, trying to get people to come together, Republicans and Democrats, to get things done in general, but infrastructure in particular. 2019 and 20, I was the chair of the National Governors Association, which is a pretty bipartisan organization, believe it or not. I would say more so than Congress, where we actually, Democrats and Republicans kind of work together. I got to choose an initiative to focus on. So my chair's initiative was Rebuilding America's Infrastructure. We did summits and conferences around the country and around the world, and we came up with a series of recommendations that passed unanimously. All 50 governors supported, much of which became the basis for the bipartisan deal that got done. And when it got snagged up and wasn't getting done in Congress, I hosted kind of an unprecedented summit in Annapolis where I brought together Republican and Democratic governors, senators, and congressmen. I'm the co-chair with Joe Lieberman of a thing called No Labels. We were the Problem Solvers Caucus. We had 58 members of the House, 29 Republicans, 29 Democrats. We had about a dozen senators, and we had governors there as well on both sides of the aisle. And we locked them in a room, plied them with alcohol and crab cakes for 2 days. And we walked out of the front door of the governor's mansion with a basic deal that was about $1.2 trillion that took all of the social spending out that the Democrats wanted in, but we pushed the Republicans who only wanted roads and bridges, and we got included in there things like green energy and resilience and broadband and cyber, all of those things that ended up being in the bill. So I was very proud to be involved in helping make it happen. I know you guys had a lot to do with it as well, and a lot of people worked on it for years. This is something that Democrats and Republicans have said is a top priority for decades, and yet we never got anything done. So it's a huge deal, and I'm very happy that everybody worked together to make it happen, and I'm hoping it sets the stage for other bipartisan agreements we can come to and get other things done in Washington.
We share your sense that democracy is a momentum sport, right? So hopefully we got one behind us.
I hope so.
Well, Governor, I think the convening you pulled together, it was an inflection point. Not only did it show the way, but it kind of embarrassed people to say, come on. And it really did, at that critical moment, move the ball. So we were very appreciative of your leadership.
Thank you.
So, Calvin, I want you to talk a little bit about just like the new Exelon, right? Because I think that there's a lot going on that people don't entirely appreciate, but obviously you are here because of the premise and the promise of electrification and what that can mean for climate and economic development. But so just give us a little bit of what is Exelon's role in this region? But then I'd like you to just start to talk a little bit about what you see as the value of this infrastructure bill.
Thank you, Jason, and good afternoon, everyone. Before I get started, Michael, always good to see you, and Jason, thank you for having me, and always good to spend time with the governor. And let me just, a couple years ago, 2020, I believe it was, the governor spoke at an EEI annual meeting where he released his infrastructure video. And it really set the stage for a lot of this conversation, as he was alluding to. And I think I went to his regional meeting in Detroit, where he was up there with the Democratic governor, and we were talking about infrastructure and what it means for Detroit, Michigan, and the like. So to your point, the groundwork was laid. But I would also like to point out, he didn't invite me to the mansion where the crab cakes and the alcohol was flowing. So I just wanted to point that out. I just wanted to point that one out. So the question goes to, Exelon now, is many people used to know us as a utility operator of DC, Atlantic City, Delaware, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Chicago, as well as the largest nuclear operator in the country and a retail energy trading business. Since February 1st, we split the organizations where the unregulated side of the business, the nuclear and the trading business, is now Constellation, and Exelon is your largest T&D, transmission and distribution provider in the country, serving 10 million customers, primarily along the Mid-Atlantic and then Illinois. So what that does for us, it provides us a unique opportunity to talk about the issues in terms of distributed energy resource integration, reliability, resiliency, safety of the system differently than anyone else, because we come to this unbiased as to, we don't care what the greening of it is. We're always going to lead with the safety, reliability, and resiliency of the system. And we believe an integrated model works because if you do something that jeopardizes the reliability, the governor's going to call me first and not ask me about, hey.
No crab cakes.
Right.
Yeah, no
And not talk to me about, where you got that power, but why is the system down? And what are you doing in terms of driving this? And we have another unique position, is that we are economic drivers in every community that we serve. We are employers, large employers, participating in the workforce development engine in each of those communities. So as we talk about electrification of the system, as we talk about transportation electrification, as we talk about climate change, which we believe is the #1 issue that's impacting the communities that we serve. Michael alluded to the impact of climate change on Black and brown communities is far greater than others. So how are we going to address this issue? And we can't talk about it in silos. We have to talk about it as part of the whole portfolio and what we're doing. That's what puts Exelon in a unique position, and we're happy to be at the table. And since the split, people are inviting us to the table because they're not only just looking at us as someone who's going to promote nuclear, which we think is very important to talk about the baseload generation, but someone who's really talking about the betterment of all communities.
Well, we're going to come back to this grid, which I think is the bloodstream of the solution. And there's a couple of real important projects we want to kind of press you on a little bit. But, Governor, one of the things that matters a lot is speed, right? So we passed this big bill, and we have the urgency of the climate imperative, the urgency of economic development, the urgency of global competitiveness. I want to talk before about the federal discussion about what you're doing with state and locals. You created an infrastructure sub-cabinet. There is a general sense that government writ large is just not good at doing big things fast anymore. And talk a little bit about where you see the challenges just within the state. And then I think we want to talk a little more about where we see the challenges between the feds and the states.
Sure. Well, look, some of the magnitude of these projects, they don't happen overnight. They take years, sometimes decades. So, this bill passed 6 months ago. We still don't yet have regs or guidance from the feds, and it's one of the things that the governors have been pushing to make sure that we have both clear guidance, but also flexibility, because the states are the ones that it's where the rubber meets the road. We're the ones that build all the infrastructure, and but we've been investing massive amounts in infrastructure for 8 years, and we see this bill as a really important step forward. But it's not quite the transformational, immediate thing that everyone thinks. Everybody thinks we all of a sudden have trillions of dollars in this big pile in the back of our state house that we're just ready to dole out. In fact, we don't have a penny, and it's basically a 20% increase in infrastructure spending spread over 5 years. So it's about a 4% increase in infrastructure. But we've done far more than that at the state level for the past 8 years, and we've made big differences in the state. But getting quicker movement out of the feds is important. And as you pointed out, we were the federal government, the Biden administration asked each of the states to appoint an infrastructure kind of supervisor for that state who's going to be the point person. We took it a step further, and we were the first state, and I think still the only state in the country, to actually do an executive order to appoint an infrastructure cabinet to bring together all of the leaders of our cabinet that are involved in spending the money in all these different areas. A lot of people think it's just transportation, but it's in energy, it's in the environment, and in our budget office, and all these folks that are going to touch it in any way are now meeting on an ongoing basis to see about how we're going to utilize this funding. Some of it, we've put more money into county and municipal governments on infrastructure as well, and we have done that, and we're going to continue to do that. Most of the work, the hard, heavy lifting, is going to be done at the states, and I would say we've got a more aggressive plan, and we're further ahead than the other 49 states are, but it still doesn't happen overnight. We do a 5-year consolidated transportation plan, for example, where we budget ahead. This is going to say, this is great. We have some additional money to help us do some of these things. We're taking steps with respect to, green energy and things that we're doing on the cyber front that this is going to help us with. But it's not like we flip the switch, all of our problems are over, and so we're still waiting on the feds, but the states are going to be the most important in implementing all of this, together with our local government partners and the private sector, which, by the way, I think that we're looking at this as a force multiplier. Some would say large, some would say small investment from the federal government, and we're going to try to utilize that to spur a whole lot more private sector investment, as we've done. We utilize public-private partnerships on the BWI airport, which is the #1 airport in the region. Tremendous growth. Port of Baltimore, where we're making huge strides in working on the infrastructure on the supply chain crisis and breaking records every month. We have the largest P3 transit project in North America, which is the Purple Line. We're the largest traffic relief plan, but mostly it's private sector dollars. So we're going to try to say, how do we take our massive state investment with this new influx of federal money, with all of the money that's out in the private sector, to really kind of ratchet things up and get things done faster and better.
So Kevin, the governor's pretty good because he just set you up, right? So
Yeah,
hello,
we're looking for
private
his money.
sector. So Calvin, you clearly have a partner
Yes.
in Maryland, and I think that's true in many of the states you operate. But just talk a little bit again from the climate and the resiliency standpoint about how people understand the grid. The grid does not speak to a lot of people emotionally, right? Like, I mean, I think everyone kind of assumes it's there, but I know you would agree that if we're going to achieve anything close to the kind of ecologically required climate ambition, we have to have a fundamentally different kind of imagination about electricity and how we use it, and just give a little bit of a broader sense of the importance of that.
Thank you. So let me try to paint this picture for you. The governor's exactly right. It's going to take partnerships and collaboration to really drive this. So you think about what Exelon does. I know for a fact that we have put forth a plan to invest $29 billion in our infrastructure over the next 4 years. So when you talk about that multiplier effect, where that 1 + 1 = 3, I'll give you an example when we talk about the Port Authority in Baltimore. Over the last several years, we've electrified the cranes in the Port Authority. And that wouldn't have happened but for the investment that they were putting in, so we were able to leverage our investment and take that to a next level. When you sit back and talk about what we're doing across our system, the dollars, the federal government, to the governor's point, it's just the beginning. But what the federal government did by passing that bipartisan legislation is set a direction and put things in motion. And I use Maryland often as the example of the infrastructure that the governor has set up to get things done. So just like the state of Maryland did, we created in Exelon an infrastructure task force to sit back and partner with our local jurisdictions across the country to say, if you're going to target and go after any of those grants, we're going to partner with you and leverage our dollar because we know we're going to spend the money. How are we going to get it done? So let me give you an example. Montgomery County, Howard County, they have a big push to electrify their bus fleet within their county, and they're going to seek federal dollars. So how can I leverage what they apply for with what we're doing to ensure that they have the charging station infrastructure along with those dollars? So now that's less capital dollars that Exelon is putting up, in this case BGE or Pepco Holdings, to leverage to get what needs to be done for them. So if they sit back and say, hey, they've just been awarded this grant to electrify sooner, we piggyback with them and get it done. And understand, those dollars coming through have to be signed up, and we have to commit to projects getting done in a timely manner. Now, on a larger scale, we talk about, in DC, we're here in the district, let's talk about Capital Grid. The Capital Grid project, when we talk about the redundancy and the resiliency and the security of our system, there's no more important place to do that than here in the district. So we're undergrounding key segments of the system within DC, which for those of you who live in the district will disrupt your lives for years to come. I understand that, but it's that important because the resiliency of the system is critical, and more important is the security of that system. So we can't get around those efforts, but it's important. And now I'll give you another example of a project slightly different. In Chicago, Illinois, we have what we call the Bronzeville Project, which is a direct example of a collaborative nature with the community to sit back and say, we want to know how this new technology that's being introduced is going to interact with the system to ensure the safety. So Bronzeville is really a community-based project. We've partnered with the local university. We've partnered with the community leaders, the neighborhood associations, and we've said we're going to we'll introduce a couple of things. We're going to do a last mile EV study for seniors, where the last mile seniors can get in car lifts to go to the grocery store, other things, and do business. Because we want to see how the electric vehicles charging stations interact with the system. What does it take for us to invest? Where do we have to upgrade the system? Does it require substation upgrades and the like? We also have a microgrid. So we've partnered with the police headquarters there in Chicago, the water pump station, created a microgrid where if the system were to go down, because that 100-year storm is happening every 5 years, where if the system goes down, that microgrid goes in and keeps critical infrastructure up and running. That's what Bronzeville represents. That's what we're learning. And the learning continues to go because what we know is that we know change is coming. Like the governor said, it's going to happen over the next decade plus, but our system has to be able to hold the additional electrification that is occurring.
Governor, Calvin's talking about some great projects, and now I want to get your thoughts on scale. There's a B.B. King song which says, "I'm built for comfort, I ain't built for speed." That's how I think about our federal permitting process, right? Because
Good way to look at it.
we're a democracy, and there's, there's not a lot of yes in my backyard, right? And so I think there's a desire, Calvin points out, you're disrupting a lot of lives, just get everybody involved in the conversation. And the result of that is we're pretty slow at this stuff. And so I wonder just, any reflections you have both at the, how important do you think this permitting process is? And also just from a cultural standpoint, do you think there's anything we can do to come together more as a country and say, like, we have a shared desire to fix things up, we need to do this together? Or is everybody going to say, I want that power line very badly over there?
Well, it's a great question. That's the one we've got to figure out. But you're right, the federal government does not really do anything very quickly. And taking decades to get an infrastructure bill passed is a perfect example of that. The fact that it's been more than 6 months and we don't have any regs or guidance from the feds yet is another example of it. It does take a while to do these massive projects, but you can change that process. I mean, we came in, I was a small business guy, never held elective office. I was frustrated that the government took so long to get things done, that we were not really getting anything accomplished in the state, and I tried to change it. I said, Maryland's gonna be open for business. We're gonna streamline. We're gonna try to make things go faster. We're gonna try to push priority projects. So we eliminated thousands of kind of things that were slowing down the process, that weren't regulations that weren't really protecting us from anything, but that were really gumming up the works, making things go faster. A lot of our infrastructure we've gotten done years ahead of schedule, and it's made a huge difference. So I think we've got to figure out. I am a little bit afraid that we're going to, right now, the reason why the regs are slowed down is there's bickering and lobbying going on between people who say we want to get these infrastructure projects done, and others who say we want it to be prescriptive and the money has to be spent on these things. And so even though the law's passed, there's still competing priorities, and we've got to continue this kind of bipartisan compromise where we can all sit down and say, let's you can't get everything you want, and you can't get everything you want. Let's figure out a way to meet in the middle and get this stuff done. Otherwise, we're going to be decades, longer waiting to get things accomplished.
So Calvin, I think you were talking a little bit about some of the communities you work in, right? You serve about 10 million people, a lot of folks, every different economic strata. One of the reasons it takes so long to get things built is for a long time people have found that transmission, the line, is just a negative. Right? The idea is how do we slow down bad stuff happening to our communities, particularly disempowered communities where bad stuff tends to collect. There's an imagination now that there's good stuff coming. And if that were proven true, then the instinct would not be to slow things down, it would be to speed things up. Where do you see good things? Where you're bringing capital, where the government's bringing capital, how do you see the infrastructure bill actually kind of animating economic development and the quality of life in some of these communities?
Great question. And to the governor's point, I often say that our aspirations does not mirror the actions that we're taking, right? In the sense that we say we want to accomplish in all of our jurisdictions, we want to be net zero emissions by 2045, 2048, but we're still operating off of the old rules. But having said that, let me talk about that bipartisan legislation. There's a couple of pieces that lead directly to your point. $700 million, and I apologize if the number's slightly up, but $700 million has been allocated for transportation electrification to really sit back and go do this. I think $68 million has been allocated for individuals to apply for to purchase used electric vehicles. So the legislation really started focusing in on the equity component, and people who have been traditionally left out of this transition, they're talking about it. The affordability piece, the tax breaks are essential there, because as I talk about investing $29 billion over the next 4 years, understanding utility rate making, that flows back to you, the ultimate customer. But the tax breaks from a utility standpoint, every dollar we receive in terms of tax breaks takes that dollar off of the customer's bill. And that's why it's essential. So when we sat back and met with the DOE, Department of Energy, we shared that. You have to understand what those tax breaks means to the average customer. That's real money when it comes to building out the transmission system. So when we talk about the benefits, that legislation has significant benefits in terms of the equity and the affordability piece. And it's agnostic, well, it's not agnostic to what type of green energy we're talking about, but it does sit back and say we should take all those things in consideration and sit back and talk about placing charging stations where we go put them, and says let's create that corridor for charging stations. When you talk about Exelon sitting back on the Mid-Atlantic region, you think about coming from the eastern shore of Maryland all the way up to Atlantic City, what we could do from an Electric Highway Coalition standpoint, which Exelon is a founding member. I'm looking at my colleague here. When we talk about transportation electrification, that's real. And we've gotten utilities across the country to join in and say, we're going to do this, and we're going to try to create a standardized model, and the legislation allows us to really sit back and put resources towards it.
So I want to go a little bit from local to global. Governor, you have spoken a lot about American competitiveness and the kind of urgency to have a foundation that can support a 21st century economy. A little bit of concern you may have heard about inflation lately. The administration, pointing at a lot of different things, is pointing at the supply chain as one of the issues that, this is where we're getting kind of constraints and demand is going up and price pressure is coming with it. Do you see infrastructure having a meaningful connection to supply chain, and do you think that will have a longer-term economic?
Well, absolutely it does. And so just some of the things that Calvin was talking about, we're all looking at what is this federal bill going to do? But the states are actually already doing far more than this federal bill is doing on all of those fronts. Like you're talking about the electrification of buses, we're doing that with the state fleet, which is creating actually an opportunity for us on a workforce side in Baltimore City to be able to train the folks on these new electric buses, not the drivers and the mechanics that are going to be working on these things. So it's creating jobs. We, at the Port of Baltimore, which was mentioned, we've got tremendous wind energy stuff going on there with a couple of major international corporations that are going to be doing manufacturing there and creating new job opportunities for the people. The Port of Baltimore, we've invested a ton of money, not only to the partnership that you talked about with respect to the electrification of the cranes, but we, in an environmentally sensitive way, dredge the Port of Baltimore to 50-foot berths. We've already got 2 done. We're working on a 3rd one. We've broken records every month and year after year because our traffic is way up. Well, that helps solve the supply chain crisis. We've added, we've got 15,000 direct jobs and 140,000 jobs that are associated with that. We, prior to this bill, are, after 143 years, are going to deepen the Howard Street Tunnel in Baltimore, which sounds like who cares about a tunnel in Baltimore? It's going to add 15,000 direct jobs because we're going to double stack trains coming out. It's going to dramatically increase the production and the jobs at the Port of Baltimore. So it's been good for the environment, good for job creation, and it's investment in infrastructure that makes a difference. The same thing in BWI Airport, where we put record amounts of money in private sector partnerships. We have Ports America Chesapeake does a private sector partnership on the Port of Baltimore that does all of that work with state dollars and federal dollars and private sector dollars. It's kind of a win-win-win. We're doing that both in transit and on roads and water systems and sewer treatment systems. So, but addressing the supply chain crisis by, doubling the production of the Port of Baltimore. There's nobody can get into California, but we're breaking records every month. We were the #1 port on the East Coast. We're #1 in America for roll-on, roll-off, and we're growing jobs like crazy and retraining workers for the jobs of the future. So I think this really it's not just what can we do to protect the grid. What can we do to transition to new energy alternatives? We're expanding rural broadband to every single person in the state by investing hundreds of millions of dollars in broadband before the federal money. But now it's going to help us finish all of those things. So, but I think we need to look at the whole big picture. And certainly, inflation, a lot of it has to do with supply chain issues, which we're trying to fix and infrastructure can help fix. A lot of it is workforce issues, and that's where we're trying to, we've got a shortage of workers in so many different places, and we've got to retrain and reskill workers to the jobs of the future. And we're doing things like in the state of Maryland, we We've changed the requirements for about 20,000 state jobs that no longer need a 4-year degree because we found people had relevant experience. I think we're the first state in the country to do that, but it's helping put people to work, and it's helping us address some of these major issues.
Cal, Exelon, I want you to pick up on the workforce issue, because over the many years, we've had lots of conversations with you and your colleagues, work that you're doing with apprenticeships in Chicago, but also just the opportunities governor's talking about new skills in some of these kind of more depressed communities. How are you thinking about that?
It's significant, and we always say we want to be the employer of choice in the communities that we serve. So when you talk about the areas that we serve in the urban centers across some of the greatest cities and states across this country, it's important for us to show up every day and let the men and women know if they want to work that they have an opportunity, and we will help train them. What the governor was just saying really ties in, Jason, to this conversation is that these issues aren't easy. The double stacking, for example, that's an issue we've been talking about for a long time and it just got done. The economic development of this subject that we're talking about is so impactful. And that goes right into the workforce development. If you don't have the trained skills, a workforce to get it done, you think about $29 billion, that means we're investing that in our communities, and we have to have the men and women ready to do those jobs. So we've created workforce academies. We partnered with the governor in the state of Maryland to sit back and say, let's be part of this academy notion to say we're going to train for the jobs of the future. Not only linemen, gas technicians, where we have a shortage of those workers. We have data scientists we need. And again, we've also done a study to sit back and say we want a 4-year degree. Is it really necessary? And we've done that analysis as well. And this has been done across the country. And Exelon is, we've give you an example. We've sent in the DC Infrastructure Academy, and I know I have my colleagues here from PHI, we've sit back and we've trained well over 1,000+ individuals already, and we've committed to hire them locally. And these are local residents to sit back across our system, and we've done that across all of our jurisdictions. So we recognize that we can't get this done without a skilled labor force, but it takes years to get it going, and we started that process, and we've reached as far back as high school and started with the high school level and letting those young people know in high school that if this is what you want to do, these are the requirements. Keep your nose clean. Come in ready to go to work. We'll give you internships and we'll go. And we understand that there's a generation out there that for the longest time never thought that they could work at our company. Shame on us. And what we have done is really try to break down those barriers each and every day to show that this is a place that you can have a family sustainable career, not just a job, a career. And later, if you want to go to school, we will pay for it. And that's what we're all about.
So, Governor, I think we've got time for a final question for you. And it's a little early to talk about legacy, but I'm going to go there anyways. So this has been part of your administration from the very beginning, and the leadership at the state level and working with the communities and moving this federal law. 10 years from now, what do you think, what's Maryland going to look like? And where are there places where you're going to be like, I feel really good that our work on infrastructure got us here? Like, what's a little bit of your imagination of where you want to see the state move on infrastructure next decade?
Well, I think all of this infrastructure investment and everything we've been focused on for 8 years, not just helping to push this federal bill, but everything we've accomplished, I think is going to put us in a much better place. We're already the most highly skilled workforce in America, the highest median household income in America, and we're growing jobs at twice the rate of the rest of the country. But I really want to see us continue to improve, to talk about things like workforce, giving opportunity to kids who didn't think they had an opportunity, and some of the things that Calvin was talking about. Like we have a nationally recognized workforce development program called EARN, where we work with private sector companies they design the training for the jobs, the skills that they need, and we pay for it with state and federal money, and we do it through our community colleges. And we have a thing in high school called P-TECH, where we teach kids the STEM basics, and we give kids in tough neighborhoods that maybe didn't think they had an opportunity. They get summer internships, and they're first in line for jobs, and they get apprenticeships, and they potentially move on. We started 68 different apprenticeship programs, and they're not all just in the building trades. And we did things in like cyber, where we produce more cyber talent than anybody else in the country. We're the cyber capital of America. We now have 17 colleges and universities of cyber excellence. So talking about preparing kids for the jobs of the future, that's what I want to look back and say, look at all the things we built. We got the tunnel, we did this at the port, we got these roads, we got this transit system. But really, I want to say, we created opportunity for this next generation, for the jobs of the future. That's what I'd love to be able to look back on and brag about.
Yeah, well, I got a couple of kids who will be employed by then, so I'm hoping
Oh,
you're
good.
right. Get them off the health insurance. So, at a moment of a lot of national division and some pretty grim weeks, the theme of today was partnership, and I just don't think we could have asked for a better duo to not just talk about it, but people who are really leading it. So I really want to thank you both very much for joining us today. Now, my pleasure to ask my colleague Sasha Mackler, who directs the energy program here at the BPC, to bring up our second panel. We're going to dig a little bit farther into the details, some of the climate and energy and transportation aspects of this discussion. So, Governor, Calvin, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Push my chair back? How's that? All right, are you ready for me to start, or are we waiting for anything? Okay, great. Well, thanks. Hey, everybody. As Jason said, Sasha Mackler. I lead the energy program here at BPC, and it's really just a thrill and an honor to follow the panel with Governor Hogan and Michael Steele and Calvin Butler, who really sort of talk through it at the regional level, kind of how the infrastructure bill is reshaping, all the economic benefits in the region. And now we're going to sort of broaden the aperture a little bit and talk about, how the electrical grid and how our transportation systems can get ready for this big transformation that's coming in sort of the journey to net zero, and how the infrastructure bill can support that. And we have a great panel here to talk us through that today. So what I thought I would do is first we'll do some short introductions, and we'll do kind of a high-level question for each of you to say a little bit about the work that you do at your organization, and then we'll dive into a conversation. And I'll start here, first of all, with Phil Jones, who is the Executive Director at the Alliance for Transportation Electrification, followed by Karen Wayland, who's the CEO of the Gridwise Alliance. And finally, we have David Strickland, who is the Vice President for Global Regulatory Affairs at General Motors. So really, to start things off, David, maybe we'll start with you. Lots happening, obviously, in the grid with vehicle electrification, EVs right now, and we know that your company is really busy on this front in a lot of different dimensions. Say a little bit about kind of what your priorities are and how GM is positioning itself kind of in this moment in the transportation system.
Well, no, Sasha, thank you for the opportunity. And first I want to acknowledge Governor Hogan, in addition to all the accomplishments that he has achieved in trying to get the bipartisan infrastructure bill across the goal line from his part as being a governor. But he just recently signed new clean cars legislation into law, which is once again going to be making Maryland a leader in, once again, in transitioning people off of fossil fuel vehicles and into electric vehicles. For us at General Motors, we have taken on the task, and we will achieve this task, of having a fully electrical light-duty fleet by 2035. And in addition to that obligation that we made, so that we will have zero emissions and also our goal of zero crashes and zero congestion, which is also part of our overall transportation planning and mix. It's our hope and thought to be able to be in partners with government, with electric utilities, with with local governments, to help with the transition to get everyone in an electric vehicle. That is our goal, and I know that we have a lot of competitors that also have the same goals and aspirations. We have made a $750 million investment into facilitating charging stations across the country. We have partnered with EVgo to have 3,250 charging stations available nationwide by 2025. We're working with a number of utilities and utility partners in ways of how we can help prepare, the transition. And I know that there's a lot of folks that are wondering how we are going to be able to get there. And I think that from a climate change perspective, we have to get there. I think, frankly, from a consumer poll, we have to get there. We need some help. We definitely need to have the electric vehicle tax credit to help with the affordability of vehicles on the demand side, but ultimately we're going to need the help of having people being able to fuel their vehicles at their places of choice, not only at their home, long term, for this to be successful. So we are making that investment. We are working with partners to help sustain that investment. But we are very bullish that our goal is not audacious. Our goal is real. And I know that there is a lot of push on the regulatory side as well, from the federal government and from the states as well, for us to get there. So looking forward to this great conversation.
Thanks for that. And there's a lot to unpack there that we'll certainly move into as the conversation progresses. But how about we turn to you, Karen, just say a little bit about your background, your organization, and kind of the moment here and what your priorities are.
Yeah, this is a really exciting moment for Gridwise Alliance. We're a member organization of utilities. In fact, Calvin Butler was our former chair of our board, and Gil Quinones, who's the chair of the ComEd, which is one of the Exelon companies, is now our chair. So we're utilities, tech companies, grid manufacturers and vendors, some of the RTOs and ISOs, and others working to articulate the benefits of grid modernization. And it could not be a more important time to talk about modernizing the grid to be the platform for all the things that we are expecting the grid to do, whether it's accelerated transportation electrification, beneficial electrification of all things, whether it's industry or buildings, whether it's building out the resilience of the grid. This is the moment where I think the infrastructure bill will have a real opportunity to, you heard Calvin and the governor talking about leveraging private investment. That's what this infrastructure bill will do. This federal money will really help accelerate grid modernization. And I, back in 2020, when COVID hit, I was sitting there looking at what was happening with the economy, and it felt to me a lot like what was happening in 2008, 2009. And we saw the last big injection of federal funding in the Recovery Act, and I was working on the Hill during that time and really saw how that federal money, when targeted correctly, could actually really help deliver some major results to the grid. So we put together a series of recommendations for any kind of stimulus package or what ended up being the infrastructure package around the grid. And our top recommendation was that some of the infrastructure money go into building out grid flexibility, because that flexibility, that characteristic, is going to be critical for integrating vehicles, for decarbonizing the rest of the economy. And we also recommended a significant investment in resilience, as well as utility broadband investment. So you know that there is a lot of money for broadband in the infrastructure package, but what you may not know is that about $1 billion plus a portion of the other money that's there is specifically directed to utility communication networks. And there's a lot of other programs there that we see our recommendations imprinted on. And so we think this is really truly the next 5 years, as that money gets spent down, is a historic moment for the grid industry to help become, as I said, the platform for the things that we're asking this energy transition.
That's great, thanks. Phil?
Glad to be here. Phil Jones. I'm the Executive Director of the Alliance for Transportation Electrification. Like Karen's group, we are multi-sector. We got started about 4 years ago. A lot of utilities. We have some OEMs, including General Motors, in our group, along with Ford and Audi and VW and some others. And then we have EV charging providers. So our mission is to accelerate the revolution. This is truly, you can call it a transformation or a revolution, but today I'm going to call it a revolution.
All right, we'll go with that.
If we want to go with that. It is truly a fundamental transformation. And as Governor Hogan said, we're just at the cusp of this revolution. So we have been heavily involved in state activities. We really like to focus on the states, mainly the public utility commissions, but also the state energy offices and the governor's office. So what's interesting about this, and I think we're going to talk about it with the IIJA, with the federal bill, it involves a new category of agencies, right?
Right.
Called the state DOTs. And with any transformation like this, there's challenges. And so one of the challenges we have is the state DOTs, don't understand the electric grid. Like Governor Hogan said, or I think it was Calvin, you turn on the lights in the morning, you expect the lights to come on. You expect it to be reliable and everything. But building out some of these charging stations, I can tell you, especially for medium and heavy-duty vehicles, it's going to put stress on the grid. These are large loads coming in. So we're very happy to have the federal bill coming our way, but there are going to be a lot of challenges as well as opportunities to implement this cost effectively.
Yeah, that's exactly right. A lot to think about here. And I'll, just want to remind the audience, we're going to be taking questions kind of at the end of this discussion for those in the room, and also for those of you online. You can submit your questions through the YouTube channel or at hashtag BPC Live, and we'll try to fold them into the conversation at the end. And I'm really hoping this discussion, we can kind of have it as a discussion. If someone says something and you want to kind of build on it, feel free to do so, and we'll kind of work through a lot of the main themes that way. But Karen, maybe returning to something you brought up in your, in the points that you raised, the decarbonization of the transportation fleet really depends on an electric grid that is also decarbonizing. How do you think about sort of the way in which the grid can support the transportation fleet, and what are the main issues that we're focusing on that are in the infrastructure bill in particular that need to get out of the ground now to kind of enable that?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is the disconnect between the speed with which the OEMs have made the investments to transform their fleets and the desire of the consumers to transform the way they drive, and the ability of the utility industry to move quickly enough to be there when people want to plug all these vehicles in. And it's not that it's not going to be possible. We're not going to break the grid in the long term, but in the short term, I think we're going to see some bumps because the utility industry, even when the capital is available, have to move through a very chunky, cumbersome regulatory process that takes the public interest into account. That's what it was designed to do. But a fleet operator or an individual doesn't have to go ask for permission to buy an electric vehicle, whereas the utility industry has to work through a regulatory process and an engineering planning process as well to set the stage to be this platform for decarbonizing the transportation sector. And so I think that that's one of the hopes that we have for the money that's in the infrastructure bill for the grid, which is that will help de-risk some of the decisions that the policymakers and the regulators have to make when it comes to the investments that are going to be critical for supporting transportation electrification. We recently put out a report called the Near-Term Investments in the Grid Necessary to Support, that's not exactly the title, but that's what it's intended to be. It's the near-term investments in the grid to support transportation electrification. And we're hoping these are no-regret investments that allow first the addressing of the increased load and some ability to send time of use signals to electric vehicle owners. And then hopefully over time, we expect this massive fleet, both residential and fleet electric vehicles, to provide grid services, to provide resilience back to the grid if we can get the grid modernization and controls in place for this true vehicle-to-grid integration.
So David, the cars are coming, right? You've made your announcement. There's, demand is outstripping supply in the near term. We know there's a hunger for these vehicles. How are you thinking about where they're going to charge. And I know that you're at GM, you're starting to make some moves into the charging infrastructure space. Is that by necessity? Is that part of your business model? Is the infrastructure bill helping you there? Say a little bit about that.
Well, sure. There's multiple components, and the $5 billion in NEVI from the infrastructure bill is foundational, but it is a
Billion with a B.
B.
Yeah.
Billion.
It's a big deal.
But unfortunately, that is truly a down payment. We are going to have to make a lot more investment in that long term for us to be able to achieve to support an entire car park that is going to be eventually, as we turn the car park over, about 11, 12 million vehicles a year, plus or minus. 20, 30 years from now, we will be an entirely electric car park. That is what we're all planning for. And absolutely right, there is certainly a lot of demand. Our vehicles are very popular. We have waiting lists that are blissfully a mile wide and a mile long. And yes, we're glad that people don't have to get prior government permission to buy an electric vehicle. That's a good thing. But for us, ultimately, we have to make investments in infrastructure. We have an organization within GM called EV Grow that is looking at the entire infrastructure system and how we make investments. We are partnered with our dealers. We have over 4,000 dealers across the country. Interesting fact, which is a great advantage for us at GM, that 90% of the American population live within 10 miles of a GM dealership. And they will be fully participating in providing charging stations for not only GM vehicles, but for any electric vehicle that wishes to come in and use those facilities. But even for the investments that we are making at GM and the $5 billion from the infrastructure bill, this is really going to be a long-term continual investment. And as I said before, we need demand side help to making sure these vehicles are affordable. I'm very proud of the fact that we have the first affordable electric vehicle in the Bolt and the Bolt EUV.
Yeah, I saw the prices just came down today.
And we're making it more affordable. But I will also tell you, but here's the vice that we are in a good way. We've made the obligation, but the regulatory regime at the federal level and the state level is pushing us faster to have deeper penetration of zero-emission vehicles into the fleet, even faster than our 2035 goal that we've already set out. So there is going to be a lot coming, and we are going to have to all work collaboratively at the government level, with the utilities, with other manufacturers, with the private infrastructure providers, ChargePoint, EVgo, all these folks that are working in here for us to be able to achieve this. So yeah, not only is it that our goal is there, but we are definitely getting a push, and there's definitely a lot of pull. So we're all going to have to work pretty quickly in terms of not only getting that money out, as Governor Hogan repeatedly reminded, that we still don't have the rules out for the distribution of the money to the state DOTs. And by the way, Phil, as a former NHTSA administrator, I love state DOTs. Those are my friends. But you're right. They have a lot. This is a new space for them.
It's a new space.
It's a new space for them. They are incredibly, incredibly thoughtful and competent agencies. But they're going to need a lot of help, too, as they're trying to figure out how to get this money distributed. The one thing I will say, once again, as a former federal agency that had to distribute a lot of grant money in my time, getting the money out the door is hard. It's hard. And we're going to have to do everything we can to help assist all the states at not only getting the rules set that the federal government hopefully will issue next week, we hope, but then helping those folks get the money out of the ground is going to be very important for us to be able to support the utilities and to support the grid and support the infrastructure.
If I could, I was in the Speaker's office during the Recovery Act, and the hardest money to spend in the Recovery Act was the money that went to the states. Yeah. And that was always lagging behind. And when you look at the resources that are going to go into the states, whether it's the resilience money, and there is guidance, draft guidance for the $2.5 billion in resilience funding that's going to go to the states. That just came out from DOE. It's going to take everybody's energy to help move that state money, because it's taking DOE a long time to move their own money. And so I think working very closely with all these state agencies and helping them with roundtables and discussions and access to industry, planners, other stakeholders is going to be really critical.
Just one more quick comment, though. When we were working on ARA, those are the salad days of the Recovery Act, those were shovel-ready projects. Shovel-ready was hard, and that was supposedly shovel-ready.
Right.
So we're in a whole new regime
This is a
here.
whole new thing now as we
Yeah.
think ahead. And states are certainly kind of going to be the point of the spear.
Yeah.
We have $5 billion in competitive grants, $2.5 billion, or is it the opposite? $5 billion in formula grants, $2.5 billion in competitive grants. Are the states ready for this?
And
What-
that's what's on the other side of the grid. That's not the grid money that's also coming.
Right.
Right.
And are the grids ready? And what's your take on this, Phil?
Well, can I first say that I'm a former regulator, and I'm proud of being a former regulator. And it does take some time to regulate rates.
I absolutely agree.
Okay.
That's why I
and-
said you have to.
and we have to
you-
slow things down a little bit,
The
Karen.
public interest. You have to worry about the public interest. It's a valid interest.
And David, I didn't mean to criticize the state DOTs.
Oh, no, that was a criticism. I was acknowledging very much the fact that this is it's a new world for them, and we really got
That's
to
what
put
I meant.
additional effort. I know exactly where you're
So,
going. I completely
so
agree.
when I think about the federal bill, so your question first was on the federal bill.
Yeah.
It's great. It's unprecedented amount of money. The federal government has never given $7.5 billion with a B money for EV charging infrastructure, right, David?
That's
Right,
right.
Karen?
It's
So
unprecedented.
this is really helpful. And it's also helpful to bring in other state agencies like the DOTs to work with the PUCs, the state energy offices, the governors. But it's going to be a challenge, to get everybody to work together. Governor Hogan did a great thing by forming a council of his cabinet officers. Most states have not done that. So we're all kind of scrambling around at the state level to say, you should talk with him. You should talk to each other. But let me give you a few numbers just to talk about the scale of this challenge. So $7.5 billion sounds like a lot over 5 years. But there are two studies done in the last year, one by Atlas Public Policy and one by the International Council for Clean Transportation. They estimate, just for light-duty vehicles, we're going to need $39 billion. $39 billion to electrify the fleet by the Biden, well, this goes beyond the Biden goal to the GM goal of completely electric by 2035. That's $39 billion. ICCT was about $29 billion. But then you layer in medium heavy duty on top of that, the Class 8 trucks, Class 4, Class 6. Atlas did another study for the Hewlett Foundation that said we're going to need 102 to 160 billion. BNEF, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, just came out with its report for 2022. They say we're going to need $1 trillion globally to electrify the transportation fleet. This is just transportation. This is not the grid. This is not the grid.
I can throw the numbers out
Yeah,
for Brad.
1 trillion.
Yeah.
So let's just assume, as you know, David, it's a global market.
Yes.
China's ahead of us, Europe's ahead of us, but we're going to catch up, right? We're going to catch up to those two countries. So let's just say we take 25% of that for charging infrastructure. That's 250 billion with a B. So my point is, Sasha, that we're going to need a lot more money. There's a great down payment, and it's good to get going on this, to get the DOTs involved, but we're going to need a lot more money. We're going to have to renew this federal infrastructure bill in 5 years, I think, the NEVI funding. And so we just have a lot more to do.
It's a great point. And how can we bring the private sector more into this right now?
You bring the private sector in by, in this NEVI guidance, which, by the way, I learned today is coming out June 9th and 10th. So it is coming out, David. We hope you can work hard. So once we have the phase 2 guidance, we will have much clearer direction on things like the plugs, interoperability, the power levels of the charging stations. Right now, the NEVI guidance, the $5 billion, the formula funding to the DOTs is just for corridor charging. Every 50 miles on an interstate or state highway designated by the FHA will be a charging station. Well, we already have some charging stations out there already, but we need to fill in the gaps. So that's just light duty. And then you have the $2.5 billion of discretionary grants that I think DOT and DOE through the joint office will do. These will be more for, I'm thinking, for underserved areas, for multifamily units, which is a big challenge. How do you get charging stations into apartment buildings and condominiums? So we're hoping with this guidance that the private sector will really respond the utility sector has to respond too. So the utilities, some people regard the utilities as a private sector, and they are private companies, so I think they are private sector companies, but they're regulated monopolies too. So they're fully regulated.
In the co-ops where there'll be
Yeah.
a lot of charging happening in those places.
Yeah, is that a private company or is that a public organization? So we have all these definitional questions of what is a utility, what is a company like a Shell Recharge, EV Connect, or an Electrify America as a EVgo. You're working with EVgo. That's obviously a private company, and you're supporting them, David, through General Motors. So, yeah, I call it an all-hands-on-deck approach. Local government, state government, private sector, utilities, and federal government. We all got to put capital in.
We all got to put capital in
Yeah.
and work together. And so if we talk a little bit about where the utilities are now, what they need to be doing for grid resilience, grid flexibility, what are the priorities that you see right now, Karen, and what's missing? I mean, if you had to think about like, how do we fill in the gaps here?
Well, I think that every utility is looking at electric vehicles and looking at load forecasting, first trying to figure out how many vehicles are going to be coming at them, where they're going to be, who are the fleet owners that are going to come to them asking them to build out the grid where they want to park their vehicles and charge their vehicles. So they're all doing it. They're probably are doing it with various levels of urgency. And also with various levels of workforce, because there is an incredible. I mean, you heard the governor and Calvin talking about workforce issues. There's an incredible competition in this space, and you think about the amount of money that there's $42.5 billion for broadband, plus the $1 billion I mentioned, plus another 20, depending on how you add up the money, $20 to $40 billion in investments in the grid. And those workers look a lot the same, whether they're building out broadband or building, modernizing the grid. So workforce is going to be an issue, and workforce around the new charging infrastructure ecosystem too. Workforce will be an issue, and I would say that when you look at the large utilities, small utilities, there's carve-outs in the infrastructure package for small and rural utilities. Getting access to that money is not easy. Getting access to federal dollars requires you to have grant writers. It requires you to do all sorts of reporting, and that's great for the large utilities. And I work with a number of utilities of different sizes, and even some of the large utilities haven't really gotten their head around how they're going to go after this money. So you think about some of the small utilities are going to have real needs for this, federal dollars. They may have, especially the co-ops may have 30 employees, 40 employees. They are sharing a cyber employee with, a regional group of co-ops. So how do we help all utilities everywhere access that federal money? Because if we don't, then what I think we'll be moving towards is what I call an expanded view of the digital divide, which is that, some of the more well-heeled utilities are able to access that money and build out their grid modernization, make their systems more accessible to the people who want to plug in EVs. And then some of the smaller utilities will not have the resources to actually apply for the money and will find themselves falling behind in grid modernization. And so I think it's incumbent on the federal agencies, but it's incumbent on groups like Gridwise Alliance and your group and others to help identify where those bottlenecks in capacity might be and help kind of smooth those bumps, because that's the only way that we're going to make sure that it's an equitable transition to electric vehicles.
Yeah, and Sasha, look, the utilities have kept the grid going for over 100 years.
Yep.
It's been reliable. I mean, we do have sometimes we have blackouts and we do have some issues, but generally speaking, the fact that we all take this for granted that we have today in this room is really remarkable. It's one of the most remarkable engineering achievements ever since Thomas Edison got going on this. But this is a whole new transition now, right? So we want to electrify buildings, we want to electrify transportation, and agriculture. There's a whole bunch of things we want to electrify. So my point is, though, that the utilities do have what we call integrated resource planning. They do load and resource planning out for 20 years. They've done it well. The problem now, though, is twofold. First of all, they need to bring in transportation and these other end-use cases. The second thing is data. So they don't have all the data from GM and Ford and Tesla. This is the utilities, when they plan out generation, transmission, and distribution, they have that data they know the loads, they know the profiles, they know summer, winter, when the system peaks, but they don't know how the OEMs work or the fleets or the charging stations. And some of the business models of these charging station providers depend on them monetizing that data. So the whole issue of data access control and who gets it, how it is used, and then how the utilities put this into their load forecasting, like you were talking about, is going to be a really kind of a challenging issue. And we need to start working on that sooner rather than later. A lot of my members, like Southern California Edison, National Grid, Exelon, they do a pretty good job.
Of sharing the data.
Well, of getting the data from the other and then turning it into a study to look at where the loads and forecasts and where the problems are going to be.
We have one of our members is a consulting firm. We have a number of consulting firms that are members that work with utilities. One of them told us that what they do with one of their clients, which is the large utility, is they go mine the data at the state DMV to find out where the electric vehicles are. We're gonna have to do something better than that in order to help the utilities plan for this transition. That's just one example.
One example of many. The utilities don't know where all the registered cars are. They kind of have to guess at it. And so there's going to be a collective effort that's going to take some time and resources, because I can understand the OEMs, David, worried about the grid, but the utilities have to know from the fleets and the OEMs and other vendors, where things are going to go, because a lot of it is location specific, as you know. This substation, this feeder may not be adequate for a big truck stop operator with 50 charging stations of Class 8 trucks, right?
And I think your point, Bill, Phil, is about heavy duty and medium duty entering into the grid. Let's just talk about our obligations for light duty. We have plans on how many vehicles that we anticipate selling. But we are also, I think, in terms of even being able to generate data, we are still dealing with an environment whether or not will we be getting supply side help from the federal government with the EV tax credit, because that's going to mean, the delta between how many vehicles we could expect to sell and the affordability of them is going to be a pretty significant delta. And that's going to be, when I am very happy that we sold so many electric vehicles that we have hit the cap. But the issue is now that, we have to move beyond that now, for us to be able to be as vigorous as being able to deploy these vehicles. But you're absolutely right. So predictability and regulatory certainty for us probably helps support the effort, Phil, that you're talking about, which is where are these vehicles going to go? And I think that it is all part of the larger ecosystem here. We have to figure this out. And, and in addition to that, one thing that Sasha, you mentioned a couple times, and Kathy, you mentioned too, is an equitable distribution of this evolution transition. We have put our product where our mouth is. We want to have an electric vehicle for every price point, for every family, and we have to do that. But it also means that making sure the capacity and the ability for these folks that buy those vehicles, no matter what neighborhood you're in, you can actually reliably charge it. And that means, once again, it's an all-together effort for us to do that. And we all want to, as Phil, you said, we got a lot of planning ahead to do. I think there is, for us as a company, we've made that obligation. We think that it is a climate imperative for us to be able to do it. We frankly think that's where consumers want to go. The Department of Transportation on the 9th and the 10th, they're having a electric vehicle symposium. Summit. I'm not sure what they're calling it, but it's an all-hands, Secretary Buttigieg, Secretary Granholm, White House, and we're providing vehicles. Our competitors are providing vehicles, and the second day is to talk about how do we sort of think about the NEVI funding and what they could do to sort of deploy that. There's going to have to be a lot of that times 1,000 for us to be able to support all of that. But you made an excellent point about that, and clearly your point about equity is top of mind for us at GM for sure.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I want to move to that in a second. But David, while we have you on this theme of engagement with utilities, what has your experience been at GM? This must be sort of a new effort for you, as you look at the business model evolving. How has the utility partnership been for you, and how do you see that kind of growing over time? And are you able to get the charging stations into the places where you need them, and what do you need to do yourselves versus what are you relying on the utilities for?
It is an interesting thing that we have been asked by the federal government to help provide information about where our electric vehicles are, because they're trying to figure out where the electric vehicles are. And I think for us, in terms of our EV Grow organization, which is fully committed to our entire infrastructure and and charging station planning and how do we get to those places where we need to get to them. It really is collaborative. I think the tip of the spear for us is our partnership with PG&E. I think that our CEO Mary Barra announced a few weeks ago, and I think it is a new world for us as a transportation company to. Is that me?
Must be some kind of flood warrant.
There's an Amber Alert somewhere.
Yeah.
It is a new and burgeoning relationship for us to work with utilities, because it is literally the ultimate and symbiotic relationship. We are going to be creating more load, but also in addition to that, there's going to be opportunities for vehicles to ultimately be battery storage devices for people's homes. So there's lots of things that we're looking at and how we sort of work through, and our conversations with the utilities is very important, and our initial work with PG&E is sort of the first major collaborative test case. Will hopefully, our expectation is that will go much broader and go beyond that, because we know we need each other.
That's great. Karen, thinking about the equity piece and getting the charging and the grid resilience into the neighborhoods that I think are historically underserved, how can the infrastructure bill help there, or what are some of the other ways in which we can ensure that there's full access to not only the vehicles but to the charging? And are there pieces missing that we need to kind of keep look to other policies to kind of drive, or do we have enough now to kind of make some progress?
I'll say that I don't think that there's enough money in the grid flexibility pot in the infrastructure bill. We were in the Recovery Act, there was $3.4 billion. In this bill, there's only $3 billion. There is a lot of money for other things that, if the federal agencies can coordinate across programs well, then, because as you're building out grid flexibility, many of those investments can help with grid resilience. So maybe you use some of the resilience funding to help you with the flexibility. But the grid flexibility money, DOE knows how to move that money because they've done it before, and it is the first pot of money that could go out quickly to help meet this large amount of money that's going to move quickly through the DOT. So I do think paying attention to how the DOE money flows out there while the DOT money is going out to different agencies, that's going to take a lot of coordination. It's going to be very, very, very important. And there are carve-outs in some places, as I mentioned, for small and rural utilities, making sure that they can get that money, that money doesn't just sit there, that every year it's going to be 5-year spend outs, that every year that we are identifying and recruiting utilities and helping them apply for that money, I think is going to be really important to make sure that there is a commitment from the Biden administration for environmental justice, this EJ40 initiative, making sure that we know where the communities and the utilities are that are going to need help accessing the money is going to be very important. It isn't just enough to say we have the money. We're really going to need to go out and identify and pull in the communities that need it most and help them access that money. So it's going to take a lot of effort. Now, I don't expect this all to be the federal government. The states are going to have to work together. We are going to have to work together to really help identify and make it a commitment on all of our parts to identify those communities that will need the help. And I will say that the utility industry has changed significantly in the last 10 years when it comes to embracing this transition. A lot of environmental justice people, the environmental communities still, with good reason, look, I think, to the utilities with some skepticism. But what they haven't actually really fully absorbed is that the utilities are one of the few entities out there, you mentioned that they're sort of public, they're sort of private, they have an obligation to serve that a lot of other entities don't have. And so helping to use that obligation to serve in a way that delivers equity, I think is really part of the equation here.
That's great. Yeah, why don't we turn to you, David, and then Phil, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Sure. Now, I wanted to jump off of Karen's fantastic point. And my one internal worry is, once again, dealing out grant money. In addition to making sure that we have the right pulls and making sure that we have the right distribution to the right places, my concern is consistency of funding. We have a 5-year tranche of money. And I think a lot of people are betting to making sure that it is a consistent level of sustaining that effort. I have seen more than a few times in my life, and you have too, where there has been interruptions of that money at the federal level. And especially not only sort of the greater ecosystem, but especially for those communities of need where, like you said before, there isn't enough money as is, and how do we pull money from different pots to help support it, is making sure that long term that we can, making sure that especially those areas of lesser need, which often are the ones that suffer the most when there is that interruption of funding, that we can also make sure that we can sustain that. But you hit a great point there. I just wanted to follow up on. It was an excellent point.
Thanks, great point. Phil.
Yeah, just let me give a couple of examples. I think, as Karen said, some of this can be done at the federal level, but also at the state and local level. So there are just a couple of examples. Just let me cite to them. One is that condominium. How many of you have heard of a condominium homeowners association? Okay. They can be, so one of the big problems with multifamily units, and for example, with Exelon in Baltimore, SCE in Los Angeles, 40% plus of the people live in multifamily units. So Sasha, the issue is, how do you get a level 2 charger into a parking lot or one of these structures?
Right.
So if you have a homeowners association that prevents you through their governance mechanism for either accepting utility money, doing trenching, putting in a level 2 charger with electrical infrastructure, that's a problem.
My parking garage is not owned by the building that owns the condo.
Yeah, that too. So some of this gets pretty sticky.
Yeah.
And so, for example, in my state, Washington State, we just passed a bill that prevents HOAs, homeowner governance bodies, of restricting level 2 charging deployments. It has to be done according to certain rules. So that's one thing that a state legislature can do. Another thing you can do is set up building codes and say that 20% of all new parking spaces have to be EV capable or EV ready. Now, there are different definitions based on the power levels of what is EV ready, but many states, the city of Chicago and others, are instituting building. Why is that important? Because it sends a signal to the real estate community that they have to build units to do that. The last thing I'd mention is the utilities offer a lot of incentives to do this. It's called make ready or a rebate. So you can offer a make ready or a rebate if the commission approves it. The commission has to approve this because it's ratepayer funded, but a make-ready incentive can help that landlord or the homeowner build out that infrastructure to the level 2 charger itself. So those are some examples of things that not related to the federal bill, but have been going on and can continue.
Super helpful. Well, we are sort of approaching the end of the conversation, and we want to make sure we are able to build in some of the thoughts and questions from those of you in the audience. And I have some, I pulled out my phone because I'm getting a lot of questions here that I can pass along. But why don't we see if anyone in the audience has any questions that we can take. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm Raj. I have 2 questions. One is probably in 1920s or 30s, they couldn't foresee how much of a problem we would have after like 60, 70 years regarding oil, right? You know, carbon emissions and all that stuff. With rechargeable batteries in consumer vehicles and commercial vehicles, in 10, 20, 30 years, there would be probably millions and billions of rechargeable batteries. And if it is at the global level, we are talking about billions of rechargeable batteries. For example, in this country, well, maybe we could say we are going to outsource the problem to some poor country. Batteries may come from there, so we are clean here. But at the global level, how much of a problem that is going to be down the line in 20, 30 years, environmentally speaking? regarding rechargeable battery production. Second question is, I live in a condo building in DC, and I wanted to see whether we could get green electricity, but substantially it's of higher price. So do you know how many years it would take for the price to be comparable so that more buildings would be willing to go for green electricity?
I'll start on the battery issue,
Sure.
and I'll turn on the green electricity to folks that know way more about it than I do. Battery resiliency, battery chemistry, and making sure that we have the ability to make sure that we can recycle our batteries so that we have lesser impacts when we get to battery end of life is a top priority for General Motors. And I could probably speak to our competitors, probably the same thing, because we don't want to sort of trade one environmental impact for another environmental impact. And I think one of the things that we're working through on a number of fronts is making sure that the batteries are resilient, they have a good opportunity, a good lifespan, if you will. And there's lots of questions of how much battery should maintain a state of charge over a certain number of years, and that impacts the cost of the batteries, which impacts the cost of the vehicles, and it's all a number of questions that we're trying to run to ground. But ultimately, being able to think about battery composition and battery chemistries, and even thinking about rare earth minerals and conflict minerals that we're dealing with right now in batteries, there's a lot of complexities here. And I think ultimately for us to be able to have a sustainable and thoughtful approach on how we power our vehicles cannot be far away from the actual immediate impacts of dealing with emissions. So your question is a very thoughtful one. No easy answers, but it's something that is very much top of mind for us at General Motors, and we are looking forward to not only battery resilience and battery safety, but when we have batteries at end of life, there's a way that we can recycle them, and making sure that they do not have impacts, whether it's here in the United States or it turns into something where developing economies are impacted by it as well.
I don't know, Karen or Phil, if you want to speak to the second question on
Want me to
grid
take
power.
that one?
Yeah, you take that one.
That's
Not-
more the former
not
commissioner
Yeah,
in me.
exactly.
Many utilities already offer what are called green tariff programs. And there's also community solar programs. There are a variety of mechanisms of getting renewable energy, zero carbon energy into the communities. And I think DC has a program like that. I'm not as familiar with the DC programs with PEPCO, PHI, as I should be. But in many states in the country, you can buy RECs. These are called renewable energy certificates. Utilities do that all the time to meet their RPS targets, renewable portfolio standards. And this is all overseen by the commission. So that's point number one. You should be able to, either through your utility or another aggregator, get, quote, zero carbon energy. Now, is that truly generated energy? No, it's a REC. It's a paper certificate, but it's all subject to compliance. Second question is on the price of renewable energy. Over the past 10 years, and Karen, you can speak to this as well, the utilities do RFPs all the time or frequently to get more generation resources. And so in states like Colorado, around the country, Mid-Atlantic, Midwest, Nevada, the price of wind power, the price of solar, utility scale solar has come down remarkably. It's even gotten cheaper before this pandemic and the supply chain crisis. It's cheaper than the fuel at the margin. The fuel at the margin was natural gas. So I became a commissioner in 2005, and I used to joke about this when I'd speak to groups like this. People would say, Phil, so what's being built in your state? And I say we have a windier and gassy future. We're building a lot of natural gas and we're building a lot of wind. Why? Because we had an RPS mandate and because natural gas was the fuel at the margin and the cheapest. Well, what has happened? Putin has invaded Ukraine. Guess what has happened with the price of natural gas? It's gone way up. People are going to have to pay more. Natural gas, by its very nature, is very volatile. What's happened to solar? Well, we have this little feud with the Commerce Department now in imported solar cells, and that's introduced a lot of uncertainty into the marketplace. But until 2 years ago, solar costs, right, and wind costs in Nevada we're coming down a lot. I tend to believe, I'd like to hear from you on this, Karen, I believe we're going to get through the supply chain crisis, that Putin is going to be defeated, and we are going to get back to more of a trading system where we can benefit from international trade and from better components from China and others. So I'm a believer that zero carbon and renewable, nuclear is going to be a little different. Nuclear, we're building new nuclear plants for the first time in 40 years. The price is high, but I think small modular nuclear may be able to compete as well. So those are the zero carbon options that are going to be fueling the EVs in the future. This is the source of generation 30 years from now for my children. When they charge up their EV, it's going to be a combination of solar, wind, nuclear, geothermal, and some other
Some kind
things.
of gas.
Some kind of gas.
Well, yeah, and we're certainly seeing the trends in the power sector. The costs are coming down for lower carbon options, and that's really what we're really counting on to help us decarbonize the transportation fleet. We've been talking about equity quite a bit here in this conversation, and I want to make sure that we fold in some of our online viewers and be equal in sort of letting them engage in this conversation. And so I have one question here that is really probably directed to you, David, and it goes like this. It's from Twitter. Electric vehicles are just one type of zero emissions vehicle. What should be the proper mix of investment in EVs and EV charging stations compared to hydrogen fuel cells and hydrogen fueling stations, and why the focus on EVs?
I am not the greatest hydrogen expert, but I think I have a concept of it from back in my old days at NHTSA.
Okay.
It really is a combination of ability to fuel and infrastructure once again. The hydrogen has been there. It has been a focus in California and a couple of automakers, but there are some engineering challenges, I believe is probably the right way to talk about it, that has not had it propagate the way that we thought. While electric vehicles, on the other hand, we have had the ability to do a couple of things that make it really convenient. Even though you don't have charging stations out in the wild so much, or as many as we like, everybody has the ability to charge a vehicle at home. My electric vehicle usage is I charge at home every night, and then my travel to my job is 10 miles away. I luckily had a charging station at my job, but I really didn't need it because by the time my round trips happened, I was fully able to charge at home. Hydrogen, unfortunately, doesn't have that footprint, and it doesn't have the wide it isn't. You don't have hydrogen in every gas station either. Hydrogen pumps in every gas station, so that's been a limitation. And I don't think there may be an uptake, and there may be some real advantages and cost advantages of hydrogen in the long haul. But I think that, frankly, most of the OEMs have sort of walked down that road and made the decision that the proposition long term is for electric vehicle charging.
Well, and I think to build on that, we have an existing infrastructure stock, and we are not just going to say tomorrow we're going to have a different infrastructure stock. This is steel on the ground. Capital doesn't move that fast. The federal infrastructure dollars are helping to move capital fast, but when we think about where we want to be in a decarbonized economy, we have to think about what we have now and how we can use that in the future. And when I say some kind of gas, it might be some CH4 that came not from natural gas, not from the ground, but biogas. So because we have an existing pipeline system, we have gas plants, we're going to need the functions of a gas plant in the future. We don't have storage that lasts the length of 2 or 3 days without wind or solar, without some kind of gas, and we can store gas. So when you think about the infrastructure we have, making sure we don't have stranded assets, and how we build out the infrastructure of the future, to me, it doesn't really make sense to build a parallel charging system for another set of vehicles. When we have gas vehicles, we're going to have EV vehicles for a long time. Do we need another set of fueling infrastructure for vehicles, or can we use the infrastructure we have for the electric power system and figure out a way to change the mix of the gas in that system?
I would agree with all that. The only real competition, I think the battle for the light-duty vehicles, as David said, it's done. The OEMs pretty much have made their decisions. We're going electric. But there is a real battle for Class 8, for Class 8 interstate long-haul trucks.
And aviation potentially.
And aviation. So in those heavier uses, it's going to be a real competition between hydrogen fuel cell, and it will probably be blue or green hydrogen, And then electricity. Electricity is still in the mix.
Yep.
You know, you have Daimler just announced a new Class 8 truck at ACT Expo, the big trade exposition for ZEV vehicles, just 2 weeks ago. It's e-Cascadia. But on the other hand, Nikola, as you know, Nikola is producing both an electric truck, Class 8, and a hydrogen fuel cell truck. So it's a real competition.
And just to follow up, Phil, you're absolutely right. I think that we have seen at GM real promise for hydrogen in the heavy duty and medium duty. That structure has played out and played out well. But I think, like you said, I think on the light duty side, I think that question has been answered.
That's great. I think there's lots more we could unpack here, but we have reached the top of the hour, so I think we'll have to wrap up there. Thanks to our folks online, thanks to the audience here, and a special thanks to our expert panelists for having such a great conversation.